Okay, so last week we talked about the first noble truth, which is the noble truth of dukkha. And dukkha, if you all remember, is oftentimes translated to mean suffering, and it's not a wholly adequate translation, because as we covered in the text last week, the Dahlia's practicing dukkha right now. I've got two dogs who are experiencing suffering in this moment. Okay, are we done now? Stop. Okay, all right. There are many different things that qualify under the truth or the teaching or the term of dukkha. And we went through a whole list of those things. But if we were to summarize, we would equate not only suffering, but all of those things that create a sense of frustration or difficulty in our lives. The term dukkha comes from the Sanskrit word for broken axle, and it's I talked about it being kind of an apt use of that word, because the whole process of having to fix a broken axle, especially if you recall being in the time period where carts were the primary means of travel, that all of the difficulty and frustration that would go into having to deal with a broken axle kind of really captures the various different ways that dukkha can be present in our lives, much more so than just a blanket idea of suffering. So the first noble truth is understanding that dukkha exists, that there is this thing that is what we label our dissatisfactions and sufferings and various sorrows and grief and all of those kind of things. Once we define what dukkha is, then the second noble truth is understanding, where does dukkha come from? So we'll be talking about the noble truth of the origin of dukkha tonight. And the first thing that we need to understand about the origin of dukkha is how we create that origin. And the Buddha defines that origin as coming from craving. And there is three kinds of craving in particular that the Buddha talked about. The first is sensual craving. And sensual craving in Pali is called kama tanha. And that's simply the kind of craving that comes from our senses. The pleasure that we derive in the craving of the pleasure that we derive from our sensory experiences. I should probably explain a little bit about the term craving. In Sanskrit, I'm not positive on the pronunciation. In Pali, it's tanha. In Sanskrit, it's four consonants in a row. So it's almost like trying to read Gaelic. So I'm not quite sure how much it varies from the Pali of Tanha. But that word, which means thirst, craving, or desire, it's an important concept in Buddhist practice, because thirst, desire, longing, greed, any of those qualities, whether they're physical or mental, is considered a cause for dukkha. And when we have this craving, or this desire or thirst or longing, we commit ourselves to continuing on that cycle of samsara, which is the cycle of birth and death and rebirth and on and on and on. The second kind of craving is craving for existence. Sometimes it's qualified by saying craving for eternal existence. And to define that it's the craving that comes when one is trying to be something or to unite with an experience. It's the seeking of a particular kind of identity, and it's a desire for a certain type of rebirth that one would eternally acquire or strive for. The craving for eternal existence, according to one of the Buddhist sutras, is connected with this idea of the eternity belief, which is that there is a belief in an absolute eternal personhood that persists independent of our body. And that I talked about last week was one of the major how do I want to say, standout from the prevailing belief at the time when the Buddha was teaching, because the primary belief was that there was this eternal self that was carried through from one life to the next, and one's work in their life was to continually get that eternal self to evolve to a higher level through reincarnation. And the Buddha departed from the prevailing belief in that he didn't find any evidence of a eternal self. What he found was that there was no self existing at all. The self that we perceive as a personhood is kind of like coming together. I think I always like to describe it as kind of like when you make shadow puppets with your hands. The mistake that the Buddha would point out is believing that the shadow puppet on the wall is real, that it's its own thing. And it ignores the fact that it's because of the wall and the light and the hands, and in particular, manipulation of the hands, that creates what appears to be this other thing. But it's really an illusion. Because if you look at the hands without looking at the shadow, then you see these hands kind of in a weird shape, and it doesn't look anything like the shadow projected on the wall. So the Buddha was really critiquing this belief that we're cultivating this separate essential thing that lives in this life and then leaves and then continues in another body in another life, because he couldn't prove that existed, and yet he could prove the other, and that all of these things that we identify as a personhood is really just the coming together of different things. And if you take one of those things away, that personhood, that sense of personhood, disappears. And then the third kind of craving is the craving for non-existence. And this is a craving that one doesn't want to experience unpleasant things now or in the future. And they, want to avoid unpleasant people or unpleasant situations. And so that type of craving can lead someone to commit suicide or in some other attempt to annihilate their self. And the problem with that is that it only commits one to continual furtherance into samsara cycles. And oftentimes, and we'll talk a little bit about the relationship to karma, but such a kind of self-annihilation would be detrimental to someone because it would put them at a more a deeper karmic debt in their rebirth. So in the Buddhist concept of these different kind of realms, we live in a human realm, and then there's an animal realm and a hungry ghost realm, and then there's hell realms, and then above human realms there's heavenly being realms. And so in the cycle of rebirth, one would prefer to move into the human realm or heavenly being realms until they no longer had to be experience rebirth in any realm, because then they would be free from the samsaric cycle. So doing something as extreme as self-annihilation would, in the Buddha's argument, put one at risk of being reborn into one of those more problematic lower realms. And I think sometimes this particular type of craving is a confusion that comes from misunderstanding the Buddha's teaching of non-self and non-attachment. And so then the tendency is to completely disconnect from any notion of a personhood. But the interesting thing is that type of desire is a source of dukkha, because it's holding on to this materialistic notion that there is a personhood to be annihilated, and that is not what the Buddha is teaching. So it's a misunderstanding, and believing in that if I get rid of myself, then I'm getting rid of the self, which the Buddha is saying is not possible because there isn't one to get rid of. But the craving for that is the problem. So if we understand these three kinds of cravings, then we can begin to zero in on the origin of the cravings. So if we look at the sensual craving, then clearly that craving is coming from our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, our body, and our mind. And we are fixated on the pleasure that they provide us, and then we become overly fixated on continuing to experience the pleasure that comes from those roots. We call those the senses the roots. So visual objects can be sources of dukkha or craving, which then begins our experience of dukkha. Sounds, smells, tastes, bodily impressions, mind objects meaning like our thoughts. And when they are delightful and pleasurable, we can become desirous of continuing to bring those up. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about these as nutriments. So just like we eat food, and there's food that's good for us and food that's not good for us, but oftentimes we crave the food that's not good for us. And if we crave it too much, it's not only not good for us, it's also, harmful. And so things that we take in with the eye are just like food. So there are things we take in with the eye that are good for us and some that are not good for us. And we can become craving for those not so good sights. And same with smells and sounds and bodily sensations. All of these things are nutriments, and depending on the quality of the nutriments, they can determine whether we are giving rise to the origin of dukkha. Same with the mind, our consciousness, the way that we perceive things, our sense impressions, our perceptions, our will, how we think about things, how we reflect on things. All of these can be origins for dukkha if they're not healthy, if they're not good food for the mind. And so even when they're objectively not good, we can still derive pleasure out of them. And so we have to constantly check, just like we watch what we eat. If we want to be healthy, we watch what we see, we watch what we hear, we watch what we sense, and we watch what we take in with our minds. And those are ways to help minimize the origin of dukkha, because that's the point where, depending on how we take those things in, can give a rise to the very beginning of dukkha. There's an important, when we practice meditation, we talk a lot about this idea of observing what we experience, whether it's in our body or our mind, or even emotionally, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So if we observe the kind of feeling that we are experiencing, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, if we approve of or cherish the feeling and then cling to it, and while we are clinging to it, we begin to become desirous of it. And usually one of the ways we can determine whether we are cultivating desire for that thing is how much energy we put towards trying to keep it or maintain it or sustain it. And so if we begin to do that, and then if our thinking and our behaviors and our actions move towards trying to keep that pleasant or that experience alive, then we are really moving into what we call clinging. And clinging is an interesting word because it's also used, we talk about it in the sense of attachment. And so many times I've, talked to people who practice Buddhism, and they, especially early on, and I know I was guilty of this misunderstanding, that if we want to avoid attachment, then we mistakenly think we need to become detached. And the Buddha does not talk about detaching. He talks about non-attaching. And this was always kind of confusing for me until very recently, and I'm not even sure what led me to looking this up, but I was looking at the meaning of, or the Sanskrit word for clinging. And in Sanskrit, the word is upadana, and it means fuel or material cause. So upadana means it's the substance that is the source and the means for keeping an active process energized. So if we understand that clinging means we are providing fuel, then non-attachment is about taking the fuel away. So it's not about not connecting to things. It's about not feeding the fire that creates the attachment. And I think it's really, really important to understand that, because there's oftentimes this tendency for people to misinterpret Buddhism as being indifferent to things or being passive and not engaged. And I've never really personally struggled with that. And I think, fortunately, because I had a good teacher who was very passionate and engaged, and she was not someone who was detached. But I've met a lot of Buddhist practitioners who have this air of detachment, kind of cold and unemotional, and I think it's a mistake of understanding the meaning of what the Buddha is talking about here. It's not about not feeling things. It's not even about not having desire. It's about withholding the fuel that creates the fire that then creates our clinging or our attachment or the desire that moves past just the normal human desires we need to have in our lives, like the desire for sleep and the desire for food and the desire for companionship. Those are desires that are not unhealthy. It's when we add the fuel to those things that then the desire for a relationship becomes all-consuming, or the desire for food becomes obsession, and then we begin to experience suffering because our life is out of balance. So if we explore our relationship to how we fuel or keep the fire of the desire or the thing that we are attaching ourselves to, then we have control over whether it is providing enjoyment in our life or creating suffering. And it's true if you think about anything, any good thing in our life, if we don't have a healthy relationship to it, it can become a form of suffering. Any good thing that lasts for a long time we begin to lose our enjoyment of, and can then become something, the thing that we liked suddenly becomes the thing we just don't want to have anything to do with. When I was in high school, I worked at a bakery and I decorated cakes. And at first it was fun because I got to eat a lot of donuts and cake. And if I made, the cake got screwed up, I got to eat the cake. By the time I left that job, I didn't want to have baked goods at all. Donuts were just like, ew, and cake is, I remember for like a couple of years after that, all I ever wanted for like a birthday was a pie, because a fruit pie, because I didn't, to see another pastry or baked good was just like, uh, no longer something I enjoyed. So we can turn anything into a source of dukkha just by our relationship to it. And usually it's when we stop being mindful of how we are experiencing the thing in our life, thing or person. So what also we briefly talked about last week was this origin of the dependent origination that creates like a cycle of suffering. And some of those are experiencing birth. And if we experience birth, then we're subject to decay and to death. We're also subject to sorrow and pain and grief and despair. And all of these things rising in our lives are sources of dukkha. And so quite simply, that's what the origin of dukkha is. If we explore just a little bit more, we can see like how we add to these origins other elements that then creates what the Buddha calls the heaping up of dukkha in the present. So, if we have sensuous craving, we're conditioned through our sensuous craving, and we're impelled by that sensuous craving. Ultimately, we're going to be moved by the sensuous craving. And then it results in, as the Buddha would say, kings fighting with kings, princes with princes, priests with priests, citizens with citizens. The mother quarrels with the son or daughter, the son or daughter with the mother, the father with the daughter or son, and the daughter or son with the father. Brother quarrels with brother, brother with sister, sister with brother, friend with friend, and so on. And so, given to these situations of arguing and fighting, people fall upon each other with fists or weapons, and they end up suffering death or pain. And further, if we are subject to that sensuous craving and we're conditioned by that craving and impelled by it and moved by it, then people succumbing to that break into houses, they rob, they plunder, they pillage, they commit robbery, they seduce partners of others. Rulers have people caught and inflict on them various kinds of punishment, and thereby incurring death or deadly pain. And so being caught by that sensory craving gives rise to all different kinds of misery, and what the Buddha calls a heaping up of dukkha, because then it begins to move outside of just that craving, but all the other things that are compounded by being compelled, impelled, and moved by that craving. Not to mention how much dukkha is spread to other people around. A person who is you know, suffering from a horrible addiction, moves to hard drugs, and then has to get money to pay for the drugs, and then so steals from another person, then not only is experiencing their own dukkha, but then now the person having been stolen from experiences dukkha, and it can ripple out quite far from that just one situation, creating a whole bunch of other ones. And then there's future dukkha, and we're going to talk a little bit about karma, and I will give a little bit more of a clarifying definition of karma. But I wanted to also illustrate here that while the Buddha is talking about rebirth and future lives that are result from rebirth, one doesn't necessarily have to believe in a literal rebirth to gain insight and benefit from the teaching, because with Zen in particular, we don't concern ourselves so much about the future, because every moment has the potential to be a rebirth moment. And so what we do now can be the rebirth that we are working toward with our practice. So it doesn't have to be limited only to, once this life is over, then I can, benefit from the practice I've done, and, ensure that the future life will be better. You can certainly think of it that way if that makes sense for you. But for those of us who don't necessarily believe or are confident in a belief of a rebirth, then think of this as the rebirth that comes with the moment that follows this one. And if we align our lives right this moment in the correct way, then it's not a stretch of logic to say that the next moment that follows this will have some benefit. And the other thing that I always like to point out to people is that if we live that way and we find out in our own journey that there is a rebirth, then we're all set. We've been working on preparing for that. Even if we've been thinking about it in this moment, we're all set for what comes after because we've been applying it anyway. Versus, I'm not really sure if that's what happens, so I'm not going to really, think about it. It's kind of logical that if you work at improving the life that you're living now, it's pretty easy to deduce that subsequent days following will experience some benefit from those improvements. So if we think about heaping up a future dukkha, then the Buddha talks about, if we act in unskillful ways, whether it's through our actions, our words, or even our thoughts, and if we follow through with those unskillful ways, then we are subsequent to experiencing negative effects, not only in our body, but also in our mind and in the moment that follows. And so we will cycle into a reverse pattern, which then we move into those lower realms, which are the realms that are, filled with dukkha. We would experience spiritual ruin and ultimately the abyss of hell. And again, these are realms we describe, but they don't necessarily mean literal separate worlds. They're just a matter of, just like for those of you who were at the talks I did on Pure Land, it's the world that exists right here, right now, but we can live in a world of hell, or we can live in a paradise. And that really has to do with how skillful we live in the moment. And so if we commit to living unskillfully, then we are committing ourselves to the realm of the hells, or hungry ghosts, or even in a more simple terms, just spiritually bankrupt. And so then we experience the misery of sensuous craving that piles onto this and carries over into the next moment. If we struggle with craving of sugar and we give in to that craving and we eat a whole cheesecake, we're not likely going to experience the next moment as one of heaven. Most of us are going to be experiencing a world of dukkha, probably with, dietary or digestive distress and bloating and all the misery that comes with that. So I think it's pretty clear how what we do now has an effect on what happens tomorrow. It doesn't have to be all the way into the end of our life. We can experience a lot of the effects of our choices quite quickly. So the last part really is then kind of defining a little bit about karma. And those of you who have been with my teachings in relation to Buddhism before will know that I have a lot of issues with the way karma is understood, because for most people, karma is understood as reward and punishment. And unfortunately, I think that's a overlapping of more of a Judeo-Christian, more of the Old Testament idea of, if you do good things, you get reward, and if you do bad things, you get punished. Karma isn't about reward and punishment. It's simply really just causation. And so if one performs a thought, a word, or a deed, even an intent, it creates an action. And that action then has results. And so you can think of karma as simply cause and effect. If you give rise to something, something results. And then the thing that results will probably have other results because of that cause, and so on. In a visual way, I always think of it as, you drop a pebble into a pool of water, and the pebble is the action, and the ripples that form are the results of the cause of the action. And what's really interesting about karma and why it's so complicated, and there are whole schools of philosophy that follow, karma as a practice, because those ripples then have ripples. And then when the ripples interact with something else in that pool of water, like a stone or a rock that's in the water, it creates ripples. And then those ripples then interact with the other ripples and create more ripples. And so it becomes very, very complicated. And the goal in Zen in particular is to create no karma at all. So to create no cause, to give rise to no cause creates no karma. And when you no longer have, when you're no longer creating karma, then you're no longer subject to the reactions that come from the action you create. But think about how challenging and how well you must cultivate your life to create no causative action. It's quite hard. Sung San would always talk about, being able to do what we call correct relationship, situation, and function in every moment. And if we can do that, we create no karma, because we are in harmony with the existence of the moment as it is. It's our interference in that which creates all of the causative actions that follow. And it's important to remember that this also includes not just literal physical action, but the words we say and the thoughts we think and the intention behind all of that. So even an intent can create karma, even if it doesn't appear to move outside of our body. But you think about the will or the intent behind our own thoughts for ourselves create karma. If we think that we are not good people, we create karma within our own bodies, and that creates causative actions and then results that come back. We tend to feel not so good about ourselves, and then we begin to choose actions that will mirror not feeling good about ourselves, and all of that arising just from a hidden, inner intent in our mind. So these are very important things to be aware of. So the Buddha talked about karma, but didn't explain or teach a lot about it because it was pretty well understood in the wider culture. And for the Vedic Brahmas, the early Hindu practitioners, karma was what determined how your next reincarnation would take shape. The philosophy of karma, and this is also why I think sometimes it kind of got carried over into other faith traditions, belief systems, because it was, I think, in some ways an attempt to explain why somebody who is a really good person, living a really good life, has a lot of injustice in that life. And so it was a way for people to explain why that happened, because in a previous life, they must have done a lot of things that caused karma to accumulate. And so the result being that in the next life, they're going to be, continuing to experience the results of those karmic actions. Again, if we don't personally subscribe to that belief in reincarnation, we can still think about how that can happen through ancestors and familial lineage. You know, if we had somebody in, you know, an ancestor of ours who did some really bad things, the results of their actions can still be carried on into our lives. And so we may be really good people doing really good things, but we're also experiencing the continuation of those causes from the family members that we're connected to. And, you know, I always, for me personally, I think of the idea of rebirth like the compost heap, as I described last week. And so we can think of, you know, if you put toxic things into the compost heap, it's not illogical to think that then what comes out of that is going to be toxic, because the action of putting that toxic thing in has continual effects. And depending on what that toxin is, it can take a long time for it to leave the compost heap. And so it's it's to our benefit to really pay attention to how, to our intentions, to our actions, to our speech, and even try in some ways to refrain from the causative action, the causative intent, even sometimes the speech that can create unwelcome ripples of cause and effect. I think that's probably as far as I need to go with that idea. I just ask that any of you, when you get the opportunity, you know, should someone tell you that someone experiencing a unpleasant event in their life, you know, might be told, oh, well, you know, it's karma, that you gently correct them and say that, you know, karma is not about punishment. It's not about reward. It's simply cause and effect. And if we can sort that out, then maybe more people will find that they'll want to pay attention to karma in their own lives versus, you know, just kind of, it's almost like we become the, you know, someone's judge and jury because they happened to do something we didn't like and then they got caught. I do think it's interesting because there are, you know, I think we all encounter people or situations where someone really does have what appears to be unfair lot in life. And they may not be someone, I don't know what's going on with the cause and effect of these two, but I'm going to let them sort it out. That, you know, it does appear to be wholly unfair. And I think sometimes we have to be careful about thinking too simply about karma, because I don't think it was intended, but sometimes we can kind of think that the person who's really suffering in life because of these unfair things brought it upon themselves because they didn't do the right things, or you know, they weren't good in a previous life or before this. And again, it's, you know, we have to be careful about applying judgment and you know, blaming the victim, because it's, you know, this is not what the Buddha taught. And it's not really part of what karma is all about. But I do think sometimes in not being fully aware or knowledgeable about how karma works, that can happen. That, you know, we might begin to think that even for ourselves, if we are having a bad time in life, that we blame ourselves because, well, clearly we didn't do good things before, and so now we're paying for the price of that. The truth is, you know, the same causative action can have positive and negative results, and they can be positive and negative simultaneously. And all of that depends on where it lies and who's in the path and when they arrived there and how they did and all those kind of things. That's why I like that visual of the pond, because when you start to see the ripples interacting with ripples and other objects causing ripples and all that kind of stuff, it becomes impossible to you know, trace it back to, oh, well, it was because of that. And it's, you know, it's never just simply direct in that way. That's why there's whole schools of philosophy built around the study of karma, because it can be so complicated. And it's honestly, I don't think we don't need to, unless you just have a personal interest in it, we don't need to have it be so complicated to benefit from understanding how it works in our lives. And so the last element is then, just as I was kind of talking about, you know, the inheritance of deeds, which is that we all are born into this life, not of our choice. So where we're born, when we're born, who we're born to, what gender we are, what race we are, all of these things are out of our control. And many of them, whether they're good or ill, will have an effect on how we experience dukkha. And the deeds that of the person before us, whether it's family or ourself, whether it's in the present moment or in a future moment, will have an effect. And if we can identify what the effect may be, then, well, no, I want to rephrase that. If we understand that we are inheritant of these deeds, the resulting effects of these deeds from the past, then we also will understand that if we don't add anything more to those things, then eventually the causative results of those deeds will vanish, because there will be no more fuel, no more things being added to it. But if we recognize that we are experiencing the results of those previous deeds, and then we add our actions and thoughts and intents to those things, we create more causative action. And so then we're going to have to continue to bear out the results of those things. So it'd be kind of like the person who actually, there's a gentleman, I want to say his name is Robert Lee. I'm pretty sure he's a pastor. Some of you might have heard about him. He's a relative of Robert Lee, the Confederate soldier, commander of the Confederate Army. And back a few years ago, when there was a whole lot of stuff going on about removing of the Confederate statues and flags and state buildings and such, he struggled because he was a descendant of Robert E. Lee. And it made all the more difficult for him because his name was Robert Lee. And I read an essay by him some time ago, and he talked about how in the beginning he really fought against, struggled internally with being related to this person, and kind of just was at war internally about it. And then he started to find a change in his direction, and decided that if there was this legacy that he was kind of living out, that he would do all the good he could in the world to balance out the negative causative effects. And so he became a pastor, and he taught to help people, and I'm not really doing a story justice, but the gist of it is that. And so here is kind of that idea that he inherited these results because of the deeds of a former person in his life, and rather than fuel and create more problems in his life by fighting against it, he focused his life on just doing the right thing, which then didn't create reactive pushing against it, but then was doing the right thing by living his life and doing good things in his life. And so he can minimize his own causative actions in his life and not extend that of the ones that he's inherited. And that really that's the second noble truth. Next week, we'll talk about the noble truth of the extinction of dukkha. So if we learn to identify what dukkha is, then we trace back to where that dukkha originates. Then the third is to work towards ending the origin of dukkha. And I'll just pull up this one poster that I had. I can share. So if we look at this flow chart, and we've practiced the truth of dukkha, so the task in understanding the first noble truth is to understand what dukkha is in all its forms. Then in our own life, to recognize where dukkha appears. Our third approach is then to continue to encourage us to understand dukkha in our own lives. And with the hopes that then we will finally realize that we understand dukkha. So in the second noble truth, our task is to let go of the origin of dukkha. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that there are these things that we do or experience in our lives that give rise to dukkha. And once we recognize, then we encourage ourselves to put an end to the origin. Don't fuel the fire anymore. Take the fuel away. And then with that practice, we come to realize that we understand the origin of dukkha because we no longer are adding to it. So then next week we'll talk about the extinction of dukkha. Are there any questions?
Might be beyond the scope of this discussion, but I was wondering about the not creating karma. So we don't want to create bad karma or good karma.
Right. In Zen, the emphasis is on creating no karma at all. In the Theravadan practice, I think it's focused more on cultivating positive karma, because as you cultivate the positive karma, then it's sort of like investing in the bank. You know, then your future life will be better off.
Okay, so there's just different philosophies then.
Yes, and
Okay.
and that's where, you know, it can get really complicated. You know, for Zen in particular, and this is probably more of what you've heard, is, you know, the goal is no karma, and that really simply just means, because, you know, you really can't not create cause and effect in your life if you're alive, because, you know, everything you do is an action, even if you eat, right? So the Theravadan Buddhism is going to focus on what qualifies as positive, what qualifies as negative. With Zen, I think the tendency in the idea of creating no karma comes from this idea of being perfectly aligned and awake in this moment. And if you are that way, then you're not creating any karma, because the function of your life is in harmony with the moment. And so in a way, it's kind of like saying that's positive karma. And, you know, resisting the moment, fighting the truth of the moment, trying not to you know, to exert your personal will over the moment would be creating negative karma. And, you know, that's, you know, it gets into semantics, I think. But when we hear, you know, the Zen teacher saying, you know, no karma, you know, you know, we'll talk about doing chanting or bowing to burn off karma. The whole idea is that you're eliminating the unnecessary causative actions of things by being perfectly at harmony with this moment. So that's why Sung San would say, you know, it's understanding correct situation, relationship, and function. Because if you are operating in that, then you are, you know, in line with the harmony of the moment. So you're not creating unnecessary or unhelpful causative action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to like not considering the karma as part necessarily of the Four Noble Truths. And really, I guess for me, for the Four Noble Truths, it's more about how I can alleviate the dissatisfaction in my life by focusing on the Eightfold Path, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But I can just keep it simple instead of.
I mean,
but
just
I thought I dive into the complication of karma again, but it still mixes me up. So I just keep.
Well, just think of a karma as simply it's just simply the law of cause and effect. You know,
exactly.
every action that you do, whether it's a physical action, a word or a thought, is going to have an effect. And so if we want to minimize the harmful effects, we want to be aware of, you know, where is the impulse to perform these actions, say the words, or have the thoughts coming from. And then that gets us back to the origin of dukkha. Because if we understand where it's coming from, and if we see that, oh, it's coming from a place that is going to give rise to dukkha, then maybe we want to refrain from performing that action or holding back from that thought or so on.
Yep. Thank you.
So
It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. Yeah, Anne?
When you say where it's coming from, are you meaning the intent?
It can be, but it can also be, is it coming from a desire, a craving that we have, or is it coming from a thought, uh, you know, our intention to get back at that person? Or is it coming from an impulse that I just want to have sugar?
Can you talk a little bit more about Zen and rebirth?
Well, I can tell you that rebirth is the notion that um, consciousness is something. How do I explain it? In the Hindu religion, reincarnation is that there is a separate, independent self that exists in each of us and is born. It lives past the body and is reborn in another body after one dies. The
Mm-hmm.
Buddha practiced that and tried to understand that, but the problem he had was that he could not find the self. Everything he did, he looked for, he could not find what is the self. All he found was things that appeared to be the self, but then when examined, disappeared. And so he brought up this idea of rebirth, which is kind of like a refinement of reincarnation, and that there is something that precedes our bodies being born here, and it extends beyond our bodies being born here, but it's not separate and carried over from one form to the next. It's a continual kind of
The wave?
well, it's the ocean that makes the wave. Yeah, because the wave is formed, but it doesn't separate itself from the ocean.
I guess I thought rebirth and reincarnation meant the same thing, but
They
they
don't.
don't.
No. Reincarnation means there is a separate thing that exists in one body, and then that same thing appears in another body, but it's just maybe more informed from the previous experience in the body. Rebirth is a similar process happens, but it's not one thing carried over to another thing, it's pieces carried over from one to the next. So if you take the ocean example, the ocean is consciousness, and then a wave arises from the ocean, and it's having this experience of being a wave, and then that falls back into the ocean again. And so all of the particles of water that made that wave disperse back into the ocean. And when the next wave comes, different particles of the ocean, the water, appear in that wave. There may be some that were in the wave before, but there are a whole lot of others that weren't. They were in other waves. And so that's what the Buddha was describing was happening. We have some, and it also explains that's used in Buddhism to explain child prodigies.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could have somebody who's like Mozart, who plays the piano and composes a song at 3 years old. Someone who believes in reincarnation would say, oh, well, that was a piano player a master piano player in a previous life. But Buddhists would argue that if that were so, then that person would have the same life. And often with the case with a lot of people who are prodigies, they have just a specific small focus of talent, but then all the other aspects of their lives are brand new.
Mm.
And so, you know, and you'll hear people who talk about past lives, they can usually only talk about pieces of a past life. They don't talk about the whole life that they remember. And so Buddhism, you know, explains the reason why that happens is because they are only, you know, strong pieces of consciousness around that appeared in this form, but it wasn't the whole thing separately carried over. And you know, for me, I like the compost heap because, you know, you put in banana peels and tomatoes and cucumbers, you throw that all in there, and then, you know, a squash plant appears out of it. And you know, it didn't go and find all the squash parts and then reassemble itself and become a squash plant. That squash plant was made of the banana peels, the tomatoes, and the cucumbers, and all the other stuff that kind of broke down and was reassembled in that. That's really like rebirth.
Okay.
Reincarnation would be, it would find all the squash parts and then reassemble them into the squash plant. At least that's how I think of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Sugar's got a question. Sugar already knows everything. So just ask Sugar. All right, well, thank you all. And next week, same time, same day, we'll talk about the third noble truth. All right.
Thank you very
Same.
much.
Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the teaching.